All right, welcome back to Western Civilization. This is Lecture 2 on Egypt. We're going to pick up with the second of our cradles of civilization. This is Egypt. And if you'll notice a date here, Egypt starts writing a little bit later than the Mesopotamians. When I was a kid, when you opened up a Western Civ textbook, it would start with the Egyptians. Nowadays, we know the Mesopotamians were a little bit ahead, so we've had to move the Egyptians to our second lecture. Well, let's begin. Egypt, ancient Egypt. When you mention ancient Egypt, one thing has to come to mind. It's the Nile River. This is all about this river. Egypt is this river. Egypt on a map looks like a large area, but you have to live near this river or else you're going to die because it is surrounded by deserts. So let's talk about this river, the Nile River, the source of all life in Egypt. It flows north. It's a strange river. Not a whole lot of rivers in the world flow north, especially this long, 3,000 miles from the deepest, heart of Africa, 3,000 miles to the north before it dumps out into the Mediterranean Sea up there. If you'd like to see a movie, actually, about the finding of the source of the Nile, because the source of the Nile, when white people started to investigate Africa, this became kind of the thing, like, where does the Nile come from? And deep in the heart of Africa, if you'd like to see a movie about it, it's called Mountains of the Moon. It's about the English explorers in the age of Victoria, a man named Richard Burton exploring, trying to find the source, and they eventually find it, and they'll name it after Queen Victoria. It'll be Lake Victoria, deep in the heart of Africa, where this river comes from. That's the rain part of Africa. The rain falls there, and then 3,000 miles later, this river dumps out. And so what happens is Egypt, as you know, is known for deserts. The rain is far to the south, thousands of miles, like from Los Angeles to New York. And then the water gradually flows north so that the Egyptians don't really see the rain, but they see the result of the rainy season. The river will rise slowly, and then it'll peak, and then it will slowly go back down because they're not experiencing the rain. They're experiencing the result of rains 3,000 miles away. So the Nile River, this along the banks of the Nile is just extremely lush because it's bringing all this silt down from the heart of Africa. The Nile River in this civilization is the source of all life. You have to be near this river within about a mile on either side. And again, it floods regularly. It's not catastrophic like we talked about Mesopotamia, the Tigris and Euphrates being catastrophic with their floods and unexpected. This will be an expected rise of the river and an expected decrease of the river. It floods regularly every year. Occasionally it'll mess up. You know, something happens with the weather patterns down in Africa, but occasionally it'll mess up. But what you've got is on either side of the river, this will be a river bank here, and you can see where the river would come up and then flood and how lush and green it is even today. And this will be on either side of the river as it would come up and flood for about a mile on either side and then come back in, dumping all this nice dirt every year. And this also provides a highway. You know, rivers are nice highways. And so then Egypt has a super highway running right through the middle of it. Here's a map showing the floodplain. This green area, you can see the blue of the Nile River in its normal state, and then the green shows the floodplain, again, for about a mile on either side. You know, some areas more to the left or more to the right. And then if you'll notice at the north, at the delta, where it dumps into the Mediterranean Sea, it floods that entirely. If you lived in that area, you'd have to leave, and actually that's where the population is going to be because it's going to be the most fertile area at that delta. Looking back also, here's an ancient marker. You can kind of see how they would mark their calendar by the rise of the river, and then the river as it decreases back into its original banks. You could mark your clock by it. It's that regular. And then the story is going to be, as it floods, it dumps nice silt into the river beds there. And then when it goes back, you're going to need to get that water out of the river into your crops. And so the story of irrigation. This machine here called a shadoof, you can still see it in Egypt. You know, nowadays they have hopefully gasoline-powered engines. But you'll still see these shadoofs where they'll dip into the water and then use a weight to pull it into their crops. So irrigation's important. You got nice lush soil. The next thing is to get the water out to your soil. When civilization comes, or when people start moving here to this Nile River, they end up in villages. We talked about Mesopotamia having cities and city-states. Ancient Egypt is one of villages. Population not gigantic, but it's just kind of scattered along the river. All these little villages along hundreds of miles of the river. And life seems to be actually pretty peaceful. We'll talk about that in a second, how peaceful life seems. And it's going to be because this place it's not the center of everything in the world. Mesopotamia, everyone's attracted to it. This Nile is going to be hard to get to. We'll talk about that in a second, because here's a satellite image today. You can see the river and how lush it is along the river, and lush in the delta, and desert, desert, desert. It's got desert all around it. Here's another satellite image of showing how lush the Nile is and the delta all around, the desert all around. Another key word here besides Nile River is isolation. These people, when they moved there in the ancient times, are relatively isolated. Not completely isolated, 100%, but pretty much 99.9% isolated from the outside world. And here's the reason why. Well, here's an example of this. When outsiders, civilized people outside will meet them, the Egyptian language is so unique and so different from anything else that it'll be called Hamitic. And this goes back to the Bible, the story of Noah and one of his sons named Ham who wanders off. These will be the people of Ham. We call it the Hamitic language because it's so different than anything else. Here's the reason. Let's go all around Egypt and look how isolated this is. Starting in the south, down here, there are cataracts. Starting right about here, there's a whole series of cataracts or waterfalls leading down to Nubia. So it's not a complete isolation between Nubia and Egypt, but it's very difficult to get back and forth. There will be trade. There is evidence of trade between the Nubians and the Egyptians, but difficult to lead armies and massive movements of people to the south. To the east, you have the Red Sea. Here's the Red Sea right here, and there's a desert separating it from the Nile. You could come into the Red Sea and maybe travel up this branch here and pretty much make it to Egypt, but again, that'll be kind of rare. It'll be very hard to get in from the east, but it is possible. And the west, no chance. The west is the side of death. The sun sets in the west, and that's the Sahara Desert, the biggest desert in the world, the place of death. If you don't know where you're going out there, you're going to die. If you'll notice a couple of oases out here, maybe, so if you know where those are. But if you go too far to the west, it just keeps going and going. You're going to die in the west, and the sun dies in the west, and we'll come back to that. Now to the north, that's where you're going to see some interaction. The Mediterranean Sea, where the Nile dumps into the Mediterranean, there are Egyptian records of occasionally a boat showing up. Some of them will show up there, an outsider, a stranger landing around there. Not a huge amount, until later. We'll come back to that. About the only way, really, that Egypt connects to a large civilized population is going to be with the Fertile Crescent. And how would you get from the Fertile Crescent, Mesopotamia, extending all the way down to Jerusalem? How would you get over to the Nile River? You got to cross a little desert there called the Sinai Peninsula. It's a tough go, as you know. If you think of the story of Moses getting out of Egypt, well, this will be the same way getting in. How do you get into Egypt? It'll be across the Sinai. You'll need to know what you're doing to get across that Sinai Peninsula. So Egypt is one of isolation. As these four cradles of civilizations emerge, Egypt is isolated. And as such, these people kind of live a nice life in isolation. Here's a lot of their ancient drawings. They drew a lot inside their tombs of their burials. We'll come back to the burial thing. But inside their tombs, they draw themselves, and the colors have remained. We can kind of see what color their skin were, and that's one of the questions that comes up. What race were they? Let's just say that they are a dark-skinned people. They live in Egypt in isolation, and they seem to be their own sort of people. And here they are. You can see them with a field, and they're doing their crops. This guy seems to be a worker. This guy seems to be a manager, so they have some kind of hierarchy. Again, here's some kind of industry going on. This guy seems to be the manager. This guy seems to be the worker. So they're industrial. They seem to have a hierarchy for work. And another thing that comes up is going to be women. You're going to see drawings of women about the same size as men, which indicates equality of women. And the women seem to be happy here. Here they are playing musical instruments, dressed in nice clothes and jewelry. Here they are dancing. So it seems to be a pretty good life. In fact, they invent beer, a way of keeping a liquid from getting stagnant, make it into beer, use alcohol to preserve it. They are the inventors of beer. And it'll make its way to Mesopotamia also. So beer, we see lots of images of beer and drinking with the Egyptians. So life must have been pretty good. Well, let's talk about their civilization. When did they become civilized? And again, about 3400 BC, a little bit later than Mesopotamia. And their writing is very unique. Mesopotamia with its triangle-shaped writing, this is going to be a strange sort of writing, very detailed, carved into stone. You would think that if you're carving it into stone, you'd make it simplified. They're called hieroglyphics. This is what the word we use for them today. We don't know what they called their writing, but we call it hieroglyphics today. And this word comes to us from the Greek. When the Greeks come here eventually, Alexander the Great and all that, they will look at this writing and ask the Egyptians about it, and the Egyptians will say, we don't really know. Because by the time the Greeks get here, this writing will be so old it will be lost. And the Greeks will just say, well, according to the Egyptians, it's their sacred writing from a long, long, long time ago. So, Alexander the Great, by the way, if you want to do some dates here, we'll get here about 300 BC, 350 or so, and we're talking 3400. So about 3,000 years before Alexander the Great, they were doing this writing, which eventually becomes lost. It is so detailed and so difficult of a code system. They didn't intend it to be a code, but it's so strange of a writing, it's impossible to translate unless we had the key. If you get a chance, I downloaded this from the McWane Center, and they have a little Egyptian exhibit there, you know, teach the kids about hieroglyphics. And look, write your name in hieroglyphics. It's just that easy, you know. It's not quite that easy. I mean, this is somewhat correct, but not quite that correct. So just don't be fooled that like, oh, hieroglyphics, look how wonderful. This would have been lost forever if it hadn't have been that we found the key. And the key was found on a stone called the Rosetta Stone in the town of Rosetta in the year 1799 by my boy Napoleon. Napoleon led an expedition there to liberate the Egyptians, and they showed him this stone. And the French immediately recognized how important this was, that this is the key to this lost language of the hieroglyphics. On the Rosetta Stone, there were 3 languages. There was Greek, and they could all read Greek. And then another language, and the Egyptians said this is Demotic. This was a language that we kind of came up with after hieroglyphics, so much simpler hieroglyphics, and then the hieroglyphics. On this stone, there's the Greek. There's the Demotic, which was contemporary Egyptians at the time that the stone was written, about 200 BC. So that's contemporary Egyptian around 200 BC. And then there's the ancient hieroglyphs. Someone at that time knew all 3 of these languages and put them on a stone, and it would have been lost if they hadn't done this. I mean, not saying this is the only stone that ever existed, but it's the only stone that we have found that had all 3 of these on there. Even with the answer in front of you, because we assume it's Greek, Demotic, and hieroglyphic, all saying the same thing, even with the answer in front of them, it will take the best code breakers in Europe over 20 years to solve this with the answer in front of them. So with the Rosetta Stone, they get to work on it. The 3 answers there all must be the same, and they don't solve it till the 1820s. The French, a guy named Champollion, I'm not going to test you on this guy's name, but the French will solve it. The English will also solve it about the same time because they got their hands on the Rosetta Stone. A guy named Thomas Young. Actually, it turns out that they were both a little bit wrong and both a little bit right. And English, as you know, England and France were rivals back then. So it took a little while for their answers to kind of come together to form the correct answer. And then once we get the correct answer, we can solve the problem of history. There's the Rosetta Stone. It's actually pretty big. It's got to be at least 6 feet tall and at least 4 foot wide. It's in the British Museum today, under glass, under protection. The French originally found it. The British will snatch it from them. And it's in London today. I just want to go back and talk about my boy Napoleon here for a second. He took a team of scientists to Egypt with him, and they studied everything they could get their hands on and drew everything, including the Sphinx. And Napoleon did not shoot the nose off the Sphinx. It was already gone. Here's a drawing of the Sphinx in the 1700s without the nose. We don't know how old the Sphinx is. It predates the pyramids, and who knows how long it's been missing his nose. If you get a chance to go to ancient museums, lots and lots of statues are missing noses. So Napoleon didn't do that. But once we have the answer, once we have how to read hieroglyphics, it actually set off a craze. The 1800s becomes a craze of Egyptomania, trying to solve the story of the history of Egypt. And what they come up with is there's a name mentioned. The first name mentioned is a guy named Menes. And about 3100 BC, as we've had to track back to about 3100 BC, a man from the south, from the southern part of the Nile, came up the river, Actually, that's down the river, north down the river, and united all of Egypt. There's pictures of him wearing the southern crown, and then there's pictures of him wearing both crowns. He conquered the north. So he united all of Egypt with violence. You know, I showed you pictures of nice, happy Egyptians. There was some violence involved here. And he will claim the title of Pharaoh. This will be the title that they use for a man who controls the entire river. So the Pharaoh. And here he is, lots of drawings of him. The first Pharaoh and each Pharaoh after will have themselves drawn with all the gods around them. And I just want to point to this one goddess here. Her name is Ma'at. I kind of find her very instructive if you're trying to figure out how does a Pharaoh rule over the Nile. Well, you show that the gods love you, especially this goddess. She is the goddess of harmony. If she is supporting you, then you must be bringing harmony to the Nile. She brings balance. She is the goddess of balance. We'll see more about that in a second. So you bring balance to the Nile. The goddess of justice. So you are the arbiter of justice. We need someone to make decisions. It'll be the Pharaoh. And then correct behavior. The Egyptians seem to be a very orderly people, seem to be very required to be very orderly, and their river rises slowly, and it descends slowly, and the sun crosses the sky every day, and order seems to be something that they're very much into. So you'll see a lot of pictures of Ma'at in actually Egypt. Here's one with her wings. She has a pair of wings that she guards over things with, the goddess of justice and harmony, guarding over things with her wings. Sometimes she'll just have the feather in her hat. But if you see that feather, it's probably dealing with Ma'at. Quite an interesting goddess. Here she is with the other goddess you might think of, the goddess Isis. There's Ma'at and Isis together. But once we solve the hieroglyphics and can read about these pharaohs and can read about all their religion, it really set off a new craze of Egyptomania.